Thank you for joining us today for the Aviation Tax Credits webinar. My name is Andrew Weens. I'm the Vice President of Government Relations at the Wichita Regional Chamber of Commerce. We're going to go ahead. Hopefully you all can see the slide deck. We're going to go ahead and jump right in here. So if you'd like to set your Zoom screen display to speaker view, you can see the instructions for how to do that on the screen. We're going to keep the slide deck rolling essentially throughout the webinar today, but this is probably the best way to view it. So speaker view, you can click on view in the upper right of your screen to do that. You entered the room with your microphone on mute, and we ask that you leave your microphone on mute for the duration of the presentation unless you have a question to ask. When we open up the floor for questions, we recommend that you use the reaction raise hand, and the instructions for doing that are on the screen in front of you in the slide. That'll just let us know who's wanting to ask a question. And then you can also type questions directly into the chat window located in the lower middle of the screen at any time during the presentation. And the instructions for that are on the screen now in front of you, bottom left of the screen, so lower middle of the screen during the presentation. So with that, I think we'll go ahead and jump right into the meat of the presentation here. So let's start I'm going to introduce my boss here at the Chamber. He's the President and CEO of the Wichita Regional Chamber of Commerce, John Rolfe. John, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you very much, Andrew, and good afternoon, everyone. I hope your Wednesday has been wonderful, as mine has been, and it continues to be wonderful with great news and discussions that we're going to have here shortly. As Andrew said, I am John Rolfe, President and CEO of the Wichita Regional Chamber of Commerce, and certainly also want to welcome you as well to the Aviation Tax Credit webinar. I have to say this has been a long time coming because since 2017, the Aviation Tax Credit has been part of the Chamber's legislative agenda, and we're thrilled to have this legislation passed for the state of Kansas, and are certainly excited about the ways it will benefit our aviation industry and those who work in aviation supply chains across our state. And as we all know, that is a large component of our state, and the industry continues to grow, and we're excited for that. I also want to acknowledge and say we really appreciate the governor, our lieutenant governor, and all of the champions in the Kansas legislature, both in South Central Kansas legislative delegation, and certainly outside of the region, who supported this legislation over the years and helped see it through to its final passage into law. And so we are truly grateful for their leadership and certainly their support. Next, I'd like to just turn it over and invite my good friend and colleague, Jeff Floor, President and CEO of the Greater Wichita Partnership, to speak. Jeff.
John, thank you. It's great to be with y'all. And as John has said, we appreciate the opportunity today to be able to partner with the Chamber to be able to have this webinar on this really important legislation. One of the things that John noted is that we've been at work on this for a number of years. And I want to thank, actually, in addition to who John's already noted, Jason Watkins and Andrew Weens for their tenacity to work with a number of partners across this region and state to have this legislation now available to us. One of the things that as we attend air shows, whether it be in North America or global, is just a realization of the competition around what we have here as the air capital. We've earned that title, but it's one thing that we have to lean into it to be able to keep it. And I believe this legislation is going to be really important to help us to be able to do that, but also even to grow globally that reputation as the air capital of the world. And so again, thank you to the Chamber, certainly to the leadership of the South Central Kansas delegation, and also the administration, our EDO partners across this region, for helping us make this possible so that it is an instrument that we can use going forward. I look forward to learning. I know I'm always learning things about what's happening in the industry and the tools that we have available. So I appreciate all the partners stepping in today to explain this new instrument and how we use it effectively to drive the economy of the state of Kansas. Thank you. Andrew?
All right. Thank you, Jeff. And thank you, John. Let's go ahead and turn it over now to our subject matter experts. I want to remind everyone that we'll have time for questions after the first part of the presentation from Jason. So please stick around after Q&A Also, for an additional brief discussion with one of our region's foremost workforce development experts, Keith Lawing, to discuss how you can find new employees for your growing aviation business. And reminder, at any time throughout the presentation, you can type your questions into the chat. I have the instructions up in front of you, or you can use the reaction, raise hand, and unmute to ask a question. We'll try to get to as many questions as we can before we adjourn. We do want to see your smiling faces and hear your voices asking questions if you're so amenable. So yeah, feel free to raise your hand and go ahead and ask a question live at the appropriate time. So let me start off with a quick disclaimer, which you'll see probably a couple times during the webinar today. This information is not to be construed as tax or legal advice, and we do recommend that you consult with your tax or legal advisor. And the legislation specifically contemplates additional guidance through rules and regulations from the Kansas Department of Revenue. Those have not been promulgated yet, so we expect to see those hopefully sometime in 2022, but we'll see when those end up getting issued and approved. And we'll, of course, keep everyone apprised when we learn more on that. But some more specific guidelines from the Department of Revenue are forthcoming. So with that, our subject matter experts. I'd like to introduce Jason Watkins of Watkins Public Strategies. He's worked as the Chamber's legislative consultant for more than a decade. He actually used to be in my role here at the Chamber. And before that, he was a legislator representing West Wichita at the State House. So Jason's got a lot of great experience in policy making. And Jason has worked on our behalf to get the aviation tax credits legislation passed since the 2017 legislative session. And obviously we kind of came up with the idea based on what some other states were doing in 2016. So Jason, thank you for those efforts, and I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, Andrew. Excited to be here today to talk with all of you about this great opportunity for the state of Kansas and our aviation industry. Before we get into it, I just would say when we started this effort back in 2017, the focus was really on trying to grow the aviation cluster and get more aviation manufacturing and supply chain companies here. That changed over the years to become more of a workforce development focus. And I think where we've ended up today after the passage of this legislation, it's a wonderful tool to attract workforce, but it's also of great benefit to our aviation manufacturers and supply chain companies. So with that, we'll jump right into it. This year, the legislature passed House Bill 2239, and it included the provisions that were in the Kansas Aviation Tax Credit bill. That bill passed on April 1st. Kansas Governor Laura Kelly signed it on April 14th. So it becomes law on July 1st of this year. But important to understand, the tax credits contained in House Bill 2239, which we will be discussing today, all are effective January 1st, 2022. So they're effective for this tax year. So folks that you've hired in 22 are eligible. Other qualified expenditures in 22 will be eligible for the tax credit when you file your 2022 taxes. So there's three components, three benefits to the aviation tax credit legislation that was passed. The first one deals with employee recruitment. The second is an employer hiring incentive. And the third is a tuition reimbursement incentive for the employer. And again, these are all tax credits. So we'll cover first the employee recruitment tax credit. This is a $5,000 per year state income tax credit, and that runs starting in 2022, the tax year that we're already in, through tax year 2026. This applies to qualifying newly hired aviation employees. So the tax credit can be claimed each year through 2026. And again, because it's up to $5,000 per year, that can total up to $25,000 in benefit, or what would essentially be extra take-home pay directly for the employee that you hire. If the employee's state tax liability is less than $5,000 in any of the given years, that remaining balance or remaining tax credit can be carried forward and used in any of the 4 years following the year in which the credit was first allowed. It's the only provision in here that does have a carry forward. So it is of tremendous benefit to an employee. And we'll have some examples that we'll go over to kind of show you how that works for the employee. But first, why does this matter to our aviation employers? Well, we know you're all fighting to try to hire talented folks to work for your companies. Everybody's facing workforce issues. This is designed to be a tool to help you recruit folks, not just within the state of Kansas, but from outside the state of Kansas to come in and work for you. And you do that because the tax credit, or you're able to do that because the tax credit offers higher take-home pay for new employees. Your business can use this incentive as a recruitment tool for all new hires. So qualifications, as I mentioned earlier, anybody hired on or after January 1st, 2022 qualifies for this if they have a degree or a technical certificate from a qualified program. And a qualified program includes undergraduate or graduate degrees, a technical degree, or a certification from a qualified program by a university, a college, community colleges, technical colleges, tech ed or technical institutes, and even some high school career and technical education programs would qualify that new hire to be eligible for this benefit. And again, a reminder, this does not apply just to in-state recruits, but also out-of-state employees. And so their out-of-state schools would also qualify in terms of the qualified program. So a few quick examples, just so you can see how this will work. Gilbert was hired in May of 2022 as a sheet metal mechanic by Airplanes R Us. And Airplanes R Us is a qualifying Kansas aviation business, and Gilbert meets all the qualifications to claim the Kansas Aviation Tax Credit. So without any overtime, we expect Gilbert will earn about $35,000. And assuming that Gilbert files taxes single with no dependents, he could expect to receive a $1,330 tax credit through this program in his first year. Now, that works out to be about 64 cents an hour extra in take-home pay, which is more than $100 take-home pay per month, excuse me. So when he files his 2022 taxes, he would still have 3,670 in unused tax credits that he can carry forward and claim in the following 4 years. And as long as Gilbert meets all the qualifications in 2023, 24, 25, and 26, he will receive an additional $5,000 tax credit each of those years to apply towards his state income tax liability. So what's the takeaway? Airplanes R Us was able to recruit a skilled employee due to the increased take-home pay available through the Kansas Aviation Tax Credit. The second incentive in this legislation is the employer hiring incentive. And this is a really attractive and aggressive incentive, quite frankly. Now, it is a non-refundable tax credit. So there has to be a tax liability owed in order to use the credit. But the credit equals 10% of compensation paid for each. And I want to emphasize that credit is 10% of compensation for each qualified employee, and it's capped at $15,000 per year, again, per qualifying employee. So it's not a $15,000 credit per employer. It's $15,000. It's a $15,000 credit for that employer for each qualifying new employee. And again, that can be claimed in each of the first 5 years of employment, up to $75,000 in credits per employee from for the life of this credit, which is 2022 through 2026. It is applied against the employer's income tax liability after all other credits allowed. The credit is not refundable, it's not transferable, and it may not be carried forward, unlike the employee credit. And it's available for qualifying new employees hired between 2022 and 2026. The third component relates to tuition reimbursement, and this is a credit that the employer receives for helping with tuition reimbursement for a qualified employee. It's a non-refundable income tax credit for tuition. It's reimbursed to qualified employees capped at 50% of the total reimbursement. So an employer credit can be claimed if the qualified employee graduates from a qualified program, which we referenced earlier. And that's if they've graduated within 1 year prior to or following the commencement of employment. The employer credit can be claimed each year for up to 4 years that the qualifying employee remains employed with that qualified firm. And again, it is applied against the employer's income tax liability after all of their other allowable credits. And the credit is not refundable or transferable and may not be carried forward. So we have a few examples of how this would work with somebody that you have hired and that you do tuition reimbursement with. So Monique is an engineering graduate. She's hired at Airplanes R Us. And again, Airplanes R Us is a qualified Kansas aviation business that offers tuition reimbursement. Monique has $40,000 in college debt, and Airplanes R Us reimburses Monique $5,000 each year for 4 years as part of its tuition reimbursement program. So what does this mean? It means Airplanes R Us would be eligible for a $2,500 income tax credit for each of those 4 years, and that would total $10,000 for Airplanes R Us. The takeaway is that Airplanes R Us was able to offer Monique $20,000 in tuition reimbursement, but at a net cost of only $10,000 over that 4-year period for Airplanes R Us. So again, another lucrative credit that makes a real difference in terms of hiring and recruiting talent to your firms. Another example is Jack is hired at Airplanes R Us. And again, Airplanes R Us is a qualified Kansas aviation business that is offering tuition reimbursement. In this situation, though, Jack has no post-secondary education, and he's hired for a low-skilled position. However, within the first year that Jack is there, Jack earns his sheet metal mechanic technical certification from Wichita State University Technical School, and now has $5,000 in college debt. So Airplanes R Us promotes Jack to sheet metal mechanic, and they reimburse him $5,000 as part of their reimbursement program. After doing so, Airplanes R Us would be eligible for a $2,500 Kansas income tax credit. The takeaway, Airplanes R Us was able to retain a newly skilled employee, but at a net cost of only $2,500 when they did a $5,000 tuition reimbursement. So
okay. Go ahead. Well, thank you, Jason. I was just going to say, don't go anywhere. We are happy to take your questions before we turn things over to Keith to arm you with some tools that you can use to help attract new employees. And as a reminder, you can use the raise hand feature. We'll call on you, and then you can unmute yourself and ask questions, or you can type your questions into the chat. So Jessica, I think you are raising your hand. Go ahead and unmute and ask us your question.
I sure am. Hello. My question is this for W-2 employees, 1099, consultants, all of the above?
Good question, Jason. And you'll need to unmute, sir.
I'll apologize for that. Yes, this is for W-2 employees, so they need to be employed.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Other questions? Looks like we have a question in the chat, Jason. What are the requirements to be considered a qualified employer for the credit?
To be a qualified employer for the credit, your primary focus of the business needs to be related to aviation. And it really isn't any more complicated than that. If you're involved in the aviation business and that's the primary thing that the business does, then you are, under this new statute, considered a qualified business.
Jessica, question.
Yes, I have another question. So pertaining to that, does that mean businesses registered and their NOx codes that are applicable, or is it just related to aviation?
Yeah, so it's just related to aviation. And Andrew mentioned, earlier that this bill was just passed in April, signed in April, and the Kansas Department of Revenue will issue guidance based on how they want it implemented. There wasn't language in the bill about codes. That doesn't mean that Department of Revenue, when they roll out their guidance, won't refer to those codes. But the language in the bill just was that the primary focus of that business is related to aviation and aviation manufacturing.
Okay, great. Thank you.
So a question we have in the chat, and I think this one was a direct message here, so you may not be able to see it, but in the first example, what if the person works for another company? Will they qualify for the credit for changing jobs? So they work for airplanes, ABC company, and then get a job working for Airplanes R Us. Will they qualify for that employee tax credit, Jason, or do we know yet?
Now, it's our understanding that they would qualify, but they are going to be restricted to the 2022 through 2026. So to phrase it in a different way, they won't lose the credit by going to work for another employer, but they're also not able to extend it out over a longer period of time.
Thanks, Jason. And obviously, a lot of this depends on what guidelines and rules and regs come out from the Department of Revenue. It's our assumption, and I don't know if it will hold true, but that the Department of Revenue does not want to incentivize job hopping, if you will, from a current aviation employee hopping over to another aviation employer in order to become designated as a newly qualified employee or a person newly employed. So I think a lot of that remains to be seen based on rules and regs. So Gina, you have your hand up. Why don't we let you ask a question and then we'll go back to the chat. And you'll have to unmute. Okay, we may be having some technical difficulties with Gina unmuting. So let's go ahead and move back to the chat. And then if Gina, if you figure that out, we can go back to you. Can you define what a qualifying employee is for each of these credits? And Jason, I may just read the definition from the bill of qualified employee and then let you kind of maybe try to parse out the differences for each of the credits. So according to House Bill 2239, the relevant sections, a qualified employee means any person newly employed on a full-time basis by or first contracting with a qualified employer on a full-time basis on or after January 1, 2022, who has been awarded an undergraduate or graduate degree or a technical degree or certificate from a qualified program by an institution. And a lot of those terms are defined within the bill. But Jason, do you want to add to that?
I think the only thing I would add to that is there was a question asked earlier about, does this have to be W-2 type employees? And I'd forgotten, we did amend that bill at one point, and the word contracting was added in. So your 1099 contractors, based on that language, it appears they would be eligible.
Okay, thanks for clarifying that. So hopefully, Jessica, that addresses your question. And then one other thing I'd note, the tuition reimbursement, there kind of is an additional piece with that one where you have to receive your certificate or your degree a year prior or a year after commencing employment. So while you could be a newly hired aviation employee with a degree or a certificate, 5 years ago, as long as you're a new hire, you're eligible for that employee tax credit. But to receive the tuition reimbursement, you have to have received your degree or certificate within a year prior or a year after. Is that correct? Fair to say, Jason?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. And then it looks like I might have missed one earlier. What are the requirements to be considered a qualified employer for the credit? Was that handled, Jason, in your answer about their primary business needs to be aviation?
Yes, correct. We did answer that question. And,
Okay.
and just as a recap on that, the bill doesn't refer to any specific codes. It just says the primary focus of that business is related to aviation manufacturing. That doesn't mean that Department of Revenue may not require some additional information when you actually file your taxes and try to claim those credits. Because again, they're going to issue guidance here over the next several months.
Yep. And I will say the bill defines aerospace, it defines aviation, and it defines aviation sector. So not to kind of get too far into the weeds, but I think some of this stuff will be important. I'm sure the Department of Revenue will get in the weeds when they issue rules and regs, but aviation sector means a private or public organization engaged in the manufacture of aviation or aerospace hardware or software, aviation or aerospace maintenance, aviation or aerospace repair and overhaul, supply of parts to the aviation or aerospace industry, provision of services and support relating to the aviation or aerospace industry, R&D of aviation or aerospace technology and systems, and the education and training of aviation or aerospace personnel. And a qualified employer, keeping that definition in mind, means a sole proprietorship, general partnership, limited partnership, LLC, corporation, other legally recognized business entity or public entity whose principal business activity involves the aviation sector. So it's essentially a business whose principal business is the aviation sector, and aviation sector was the definition I just read. So you can get pretty far into the weeds. We got a question in the chat from Linda Coleman. Does the employee claim the recruitment incentive on his or her personal tax return at the end of the year?
Yes.
So while it's eligible starting 2022, yeah, they'll notice the benefit once they file their taxes early next year, right, Jason?
Yeah, that's correct. And just to a little more detail. So if you are a certified tax preparer, CPA, you get a lot of information, both from the IRS and the Kansas Department of Revenue, on how to correctly file these credits. So that's not to say that, I think we were using the example of Gilbert went to work for Airplanes R Us. That's not to say that he can't do it on his own, but the tax professionals will receive all kinds of information and guidance on how to claim these credits on behalf of the folks that they're doing taxes for.
All right, we've got a question from Buddy. When are we expecting the guidance to be released from the Department of Revenue? Any idea on that? Any guesses, Jason?
My guess would be the around October. Department of Revenue is a state agency. Again, while this credit's in effect for 2022, this bill's not actually law until July 1st. And so they will begin taking all of the tax legislation that was passed, and they will start through their processes of evaluating and issuing guidance. So it's typically, I believe, around October.
Okay. Yeah, hopefully sooner the better. We'll see what happens. The slide in front of you, hopefully you can see, says we may pass along general and unattributed concerns and questions to the administration in the meantime as appropriate. Based on feedback we received from you all, not only in this webinar, but outside of it as well, just highlighting issues or questions that have come up since the legislation was passed. So, and I apologize for the slide deck scrolling through a little bit. I'm trying to scroll through the legislation at the same time. So you do have a URL link on this slide also, www.aircapitaloftheworld.com/tax credits. I believe right now, if you visit that URL, it will take you to the registration page that you use to sign up for this webinar. But in the next few days, we will go live with a page that will contain all the information. Marcy Vargas had a question. Will we be emailed all these details after the meeting? Yes. In the next few days, we'll get you all an email that has the proper URL and web link. It'll contain information on the legislation. It'll have some handouts that you can use if you're holding a jobs fair or attending a jobs fair. that you can pass out to employees with information on the employee recruitment tax credit. It will have a one pager for you all on the three different tax credits that are all parts of this bill. So appreciate our friends at the Greater Wichita Partnership and all their work on putting this website together. And so, yeah, you will receive all that soon, Marcy. We'll send a recording of today's presentation to those who registered also, so you can share it with others who are in your company or your peer group companies that you, I guess, want to have information about this tax credit that they'll be using to compete for the same employees that you are. Feel free to share it with whoever. We're going to do our best to get the word out, obviously, to lots of different folks around the state. We'll also post the slide deck, maybe take out a few of these slides about the Zoom instructions and whatnot, and other resources following the webinar. So that'll be on that website that's in front of you. Sam has a question in the chat. Jason, with more and more companies allowing associates to telework or offering remote working, are the qualified associates limited to working in Kansas, or are they allowed to work outside of Kansas?
So that's a complicated question or answer. It all depends on where that employee is filing their income tax. So if they're working in another state and they're filing income tax in that state and not filing in Kansas, then no, there would not be eligibility for those credits. I say it's complicated because we, for example, have an agreement with Missouri. We have plenty of people that that work in one state or the other, but are allowed to file in the state that they live in. But that's by agreement between those two states. For the most part, the state where you earn your income is the state where you must file a tax return. And sometimes people even have to file multiple state tax returns because they've earned income in multiple states throughout that taxing year.
Thanks, Jason. And this may or may not be hashed out more in the rules and regs from the Department of Revenue. We shall see. Okay, so Gina has a question. Are there recorded guidelines for these employees and coding them a certain way? How do we determine what actually qualifies them for this credit?
Well, again, there's multiple credits here. So they have to be taking an aviation job with an aviation employer, and they must have one of those either degrees or certificates from a qualified program. And Andrew, I don't know if we can pull the language up that we pulled up earlier in the slides, but they need to be going to work, number one, for a qualified employer, and then to be a qualified employee, it has to be an aviation job. And Andrew kind of read the language earlier about that, how they defined that, which was pretty broad, which was intentional. But they also have to have one of these degrees or certificates in order to qualify. And those qualifications must be for both the employee to receive the credit and as well as the employer to receive the credit for hiring them. So hopefully I was clear enough on that answer. If not, ping us and we'll try to give you more detail. I did see a question in the chat that I think is a little bit or somewhat related to this. Will we email out the contents of the legislation? I think what we can do is email out the language that was in the bill that relates to the aviation tax credit. The aviation tax credit bill that we've just discussed with you was a standalone bill that worked its way through the legislative session. As we got to the end of the legislative session, it got put into what's called a conference committee report. And so they took multiple tax bills, put them in one package and ran them across both floors for approval. So there's an awful lot in the bill that has no relation to the aviation tax credit, but we can send out the actual language that was in the bill related to the credit.
Hey, Jason, on that URL, the aircapitaltheworld.com/tax credits, we are going to have a link to the bill, and we have highlighted the relevant portions of the legislation. So I believe in this legislation, House Bill 2239 starts on page 4 and then goes through page 6. So it's not a very long bill, but it's actually it's not a very long portion that deals with aviation tax credits, but the full bill is 53 pages. So that's why we've tried to highlight that for you so you can go read the specific language. So let's keep moving here. Matt, does the 15% of comp apply to all comp, including bonus, overtime, et cetera? And Jason, I might just read the definition of compensation for purposes of this tax credit, if you're okay with that.
Sure.
So compensation, according to, for this part of the bill, for the aviation tax credits, it means payments in the form of contract labor for which the payer is required to provide a federal tax form 1099 to the person paid, which we discussed earlier and clarified that. Wages subject to withholding tax paid to a part-time employee or full-time employee, or salary or other remuneration. Compensation does not include employer-provided retirement, medical or healthcare benefits, reimbursement for travel, meals, lodging, or any other expense. So it's essentially wages or 1099 income.
But including overtime.
Yes. Okay, next question. Is there a listing of qualified high school programs available or a definition of that term? That is a good question. I think, Jason, you can weigh in here, but the reason we mentioned the qualifying like high school CTE programs is because of the definition in the bill that cites other statutory language in Kansas law. So I don't know that we have specifics about which CTE programs would qualify. Jason, do you care?
No, and this was an issue that we kind of talked about actually as we were preparing this slide deck. Quite frankly, those definitions are hard to come by at this point. We actually went back and forth on whether to even include the language about certain high school programs, but because it was in the bill, we thought it was important to include that. I think ultimately this is going to come down to Department of Revenue having to work with Department of Commerce and even Education on what are qualified high school certificate programs. So we don't have a good answer for you on that today.
Yeah, sorry about that. And some of this may be, again, in the rules and regs issued by Revenue. Robin, I think this was answered earlier, but Robin, there will be a copy of the HB 2239 legislation included in the documents with the relevant sections highlighted. Kim West asks if this will qualify for interns.
Well, if the intern has, if you're paying them, so if it's a paid internship and they meet the qualifications based on educational achievement that they've already attained, then yes, they would qualify.
Okay, Matt asks, how does termination within or subsequent to the year of hire impact the employee and employer credits?
Well, keep in mind the employer credits are a percentage. So let's go back to the example with Gilbert. If Airplanes RS hired Gilbert and they hired him on January 1st, 2022, and Gilbert was terminated for whatever reason on July 1st, 2022, they're still able to apply that 15% tax credit to what they paid him through those first 6 months.
Okay, Lindsay asks, was there any consideration for credits to help companies retain current employees? These credits seem to encourage employees to switch jobs rather than stay with their current employers.
Yeah, I'll say in the process of trying to pass legislation, there's a lot of things that get considered. And at the end of the day, it comes down to what's the fiscal note. And a fiscal note is prepared by, in this case, the Department of Revenue to say, we estimate this legislation will cost the state this much. Because keep in mind, when the state issues tax credits or when they do something that even allows a person to avoid paying a tax, they see that as a cost to the state's bottom line. And so it really comes down to what's the cost and what's the appetite within the legislature. And that equals what you can get passed and what you cannot get passed. And so there certainly would be benefit to trying to work on additional programs to help with retaining employees. But this was about as much as we were going to be able to get done in terms of the effort to attract employees to aviation employers in the state of Kansas. And again, a big focus is also to try to bring them from outside of the state. Not to talk too long on this subject, but the first iteration of this bill only allowed the qualified programs on the educational side had to be Kansas institutions. And we pretty quickly realized that's going to stop us from recruiting people from outside the state into the state. And so, again, apologize for the long answer, but there's certainly benefits to this bill, but is it a fix-all for the industry? Does it fix every concern? Certainly not. And I guess I'd close on that statement with saying there are programs out there through Department of Commerce to help with retaining employees that you can talk with Department of Commerce representatives about.
Another question, Jason, is this tax credit for skilled labor, or for example, if an aviation employer hires a buyer and graduate with a business degree, is that person considered eligible for the tax credit?
I think it would depend on the type of business degree and the institution in which they got it or that they got it from.
I think that's fair to say. The qualified program definition in the legislation is pretty broad. So it's intended to encompass engineers, Associate of Applied Science degree, CTE programs, regional programs that are accredited by regional accrediting bodies, which is probably about any institution, higher education institution, certainly all the regions institutions and community college, tech colleges in Kansas, right, Jason?
Yeah, the regional accrediting body those are what accredit your private institutions. So that language was added to make sure that our private colleges in the state, that their programs qualified under this law.
Okay, next question. And I think we handled that. So 1099 employees are eligible under this bill. When Andrew discussed the definition of compensation, I guess it was a little bit confusing. So maybe just clarify one more time, Jason. 1099 employees are eligible, correct?
They are eligible. That was added to the bill. If you go back, it talks about employees and contractors.
Yes, sorry for the confusion, Jessica, but yes, 1099 employees are eligible. Okay, I don't see any more questions in the chat. We have a couple minutes if there are any questions, if anyone wants to raise their hand or ask further questions in the chat. Obviously, we're giving you the answers that we know at this time, and more information is forthcoming. So looks like we just got one more pop up, Jason. Did I understand correctly, the degree or certification must be received 1 year prior to the hire or received within 1 year after hire? If a new employee hired received a degree a couple of years prior, they will not be eligible. So I think that's a helpful question from Tammy. So it doesn't matter when you received your degree or certification to receive the employee tax credit. but to be eligible to receive tuition reimbursement, it has to be received within 1 year prior to or following your hire. Is that correct, Jason?
Yes, that is.
So the only of the 3 tax credits here, the tuition reimbursement is the only one that requires the degree to be received within 1 year of the hire date. You can receive the employer tax credit for a qualifying employee who received their degree 5 years ago. And the employee can receive the employee tax credit if they have a qualifying degree or certification received 10 years ago. I hope that's helpful. Okay, last call for questions here before we turn it over to Keith Lawing to talk to us about some options to recruit employees. Okay, we've got one question. So if the employee comes with a certificate they received 6 months ago, we are able to reimburse tuition incurred before they became an employee.
Yeah, Matt, that's correct. Absolutely.
Okay, and I think we'll turn it over to Keith now. We also will allow you to go ahead and put questions in the chat, and we'll cover those. We do have one more. I'm sorry. It's a new employee, correct? So if you have had an employee for 5 years who got certification, they aren't qualified. That's correct. It has to be a newly hired employee after January 1. Okay, so allow me to introduce Keith Lawing, President and CEO of the Workforce Alliance of South Central Kansas. The Workforce Alliance operates the Workforce Centers of South Central Kansas as a one-stop resource for job seekers and employers. The Workforce Alliance specializes in convening partnerships and implementing strategies to grow the regional economy, administers the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, WIOA, in the Wichita metro area, and manages a number of strategic employment and training initiatives. Keith has been very involved with Wichita Chamber as well. He serves as the chair of our Workforce Solutions Subcommittee, which started out as the Advanced Manufacturing Talent Task Force, which originally decided to push for the Aviation Tax Credits legislation back in 2016. Feels like half a lifetime ago. Keith will help provide some background about what tools are available to aerospace employers to attract new employees in this industry. And I would say this information should be helpful to you no matter where you're located in Kansas, because your local workforce center will provide many of these same services, although of course no one does it better than Keith. So Keith, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Andrew. Very much appreciate that. And also really a thanks to the Chamber, Andrew, you and Jason, and all the work put in on this particular piece of legislation, and certainly our friends at the Greater Wichita Partnership as well. A great example of a collaborative strategy, leveraging resources coming together to have a good impact on our economy here in the region. Like Andrew said, we're your friendly neighborhood local workforce development board in the Wichita metro area. The slide in front of you has a picture of our office here in Wichita at 21st and Amadon. We also have offices in El Dorado, down a partnership with Cowley Community College in Arc City, and we have an office in Sumner County as well. And if you want to go ahead and Jason Andrew jump to the next slide. As far as our services to businesses, and again, this will be part of the follow-up you get. Some of you may be very familiar with us. Some of you maybe not so much, but we can certainly, employers are our primary customer. Job seekers are customers as well, but we really strive to do a great job of serving employers. We can help very basic sourcing talent, helping businesses, and the list you see there when it comes to recruiting and hiring. If we get to that layoff situation, again, we can certainly help you with the impacted employees you have in your operation, and also attach them to some resources to help them get back into the workforce. I'm going to talk a little bit about the training side of what we're doing, because I think it fits nicely. It could fit nicely with some of the tax credit information that Andrew and Jason were sharing with us. We can help fund, in some instances, an employer underwrite those costs of training, whether it's an on-the-job training, whether it's incumbent worker training. We can also help to work that, connect that company to other training funded programs through the state of Kansas. go ahead and jump to the next slide and we'll get a little more specific about what I want to kind of bring up today. And I also have Amanda Duncan with me. She's my VP for Business Development. Amanda's really is the point person on the grant that I want to talk about. So if there's some questions, if we have time for questions during this webinar, Amanda and I will help answer those, or please follow up with us afterwards, and we will definitely provide our contact information. But we received what we call the One Workforce Grant, a little over $10 million a couple of years ago, and it's really focused on employer-led training programs. So we can kind of meet that demand. We're looking for those emerging occupations, those emerging skill sets that are coming due to technological advances, and how do we help a company keep on top of or get ahead of some of those trends so they can bring in new workers or train existing workers. And first off, we can provide up to $6,000 for qualified new hire for employer-led on-site training. So again, you hire somebody, they don't quite have the skill set you need. We'll work with that company, especially in the aviation, advanced manufacturing, and IT space, information technology space, to figure out how we can help those companies invest in that training. We can also create scholarships at a technical or community college for certificate or associate degree programs. So if you're a company and you know you're going to need to hire a certain amount of avionic technicians, and you need a place to source that talent, we will then help provide scholarships to either WSU Tech or Butler Community College for those positions, with not a guarantee for a job, but a guarantee that you will at least interview these candidates, that they will have an opportunity, with the belief that even if maybe market conditions change by the time you committed to that or said you needed that hire, that skill set they have achieved will be applicable to the labor market, and another company within the sector could use that skill and talent. And then we also, for a higher level skill set, can provide up to $13,000 in tuition assistance or scholarships at the university level, or for undergrad or graduate degree programs. And I think this is really relevant to the tax credit conversation, because we can help the company stack these credits together. You can hire somebody that the training was paid for through this grant into your company and still get that tax credit as well. And it, again, is just an additional tool that we want to bring to our companies here in South Central Kansas to really help you accelerate your ability to bring on talent and get them to that level of productivity. So we appreciate the opportunity, again, to have this conversation. Like I said, a lot of businesses, a lot of companies know us very well. They work closely with us. If this is the first time you've heard about this grant, please, after the webinar, get in touch with us. If you think this could help your company, we would be happy to sit down and talk to you and see what we could work together. We have about 2 more years in this grant. So it's not going away anytime soon. It started out as a $10 million grant. We're whittling that down, but our goal is to spend all that money. And so we need some employers to come bang on our door. So again, I want to thank Andrew and Jason and all our friends at the Wichita Chamber and the Greater Wichita Partnership for this opportunity and the chance to work with you all. It's been a great experience, and just really pleased that we got this tax credit over the finish line. So Andrew, happy to answer any questions if there are any, or looking forward to follow up with anybody on the webinar.
Great. Thank you, Keith. So let me offer a quick few reminders before we head out. Make sure to visit this URL in the next few days, www.aircapitaloftheworld.com/tax credits. Still kind of under the final finishing touches, but we will send this out to all the webinar registrants. So really, you don't have to do anything other than look for an email from us in a few days with the follow-up information. We recorded this webinar, and we'll post that link at the website as well, along with the highlighted bill text and a couple of one-pagers for your use. We'll also be working on turning this chat into, and some of the questions we received today, into an FAQ type document to hopefully help answer as many questions as we can right now, with the understanding that there's more information coming from the Department of Revenue likely. If you have other questions in the meantime, you can go ahead and email them to me at aweens@wichitachamber.org. or you can even call me and I'll do my best to get you an answer to the extent we can. And one last time, this information is not to be construed as tax or legal advice, and we recommend that you consult with your tax or legal advisor. And the Kansas Department of Revenue will probably issue further guidelines in the form of rules and regulations later this year. So with that, I do want to say thank you for attending today. We really appreciate you joining us, and we appreciate all you do to not only grow your business, but grow the Kansas economy. We hope this was helpful, and have a wonderful day. Thanks, everybody.